Some men spend their whole lives searching for the right woman. Ethan Calloway only had to open one wagon door to realize he had been searching for the wrong idea. The stagecoach rolled into Dry Creek just before noon, its iron wheels groaning against the hard-packed road. Dust drifted through the air like faded memories, settling over rooftops, fences, and the boots of every curious soul gathered outside the little church. News traveled faster than horses in a town that small. The lonely cowboy was finally getting married. Old women whispered behind folded fans. Ranch hands leaned against hitching posts with crooked smiles. Even children abandoned their games to watch the arrival. Everyone already imagined the bride. A quiet white girl from somewhere back east. Soft hands. Shy smile. A woman who would bring curtains to Ethan's lonely cabin and laughter to the empty fields surrounding Broken Creek Ranch. Ethan imagined the same thing. Not because beauty mattered to him. Because ordinary felt safe. His father had spent his last weeks insisting that one sealed letter would someday explain everything. Ethan never found that explanation. He only found a legal document bearing an unfamiliar signature and one impossible condition. Marry the woman whose name appears below. Only then would the ranch truly become his. He had argued, questioned, even cursed the paper more than once. But the lawyer simply folded his hands. Your father never broke his word. So Ethan decided neither would he. The stagecoach stopped. Silence settled over the street. The driver climbed down first, wiping sweat from beneath his hat. He opened the wooden door. Everyone leaned forward. A polished leather boot touched the step. Then another. The woman who emerged carried herself with calm that didn't belong to strangers. She wore no lace, no white veil, no expensive dress. A long buckskin garment moved gently with the breeze, embroidered by careful hands using blue and silver thread that shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Around her neck rested a small turquoise pendant worn smooth by many years. Her dark braided hair fell neatly over one shoulder. Her skin carried the warm bronze tone of someone raised beneath endless western skies. Apache. No one breathed. Somebody dropped a basket of apples. One rolled slowly across the street before stopping against Ethan's boot. No one bent to pick it up. The church bell continued swinging above them, but somehow even its sound seemed distant now. Ethan stared without blinking. The woman lifted her eyes. They were steady, clear, not frightened, not ashamed. She looked directly at the man she had never met. For one heartbeat, neither moved. Then the murmurs began. They can't be serious. She's Apache. There's been some mistake. The lawyer brought the wrong woman. The whispers spread like prairie fire carried by dry wind. A little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. Ma, is she really the bride? His mother pulled him closer without answering. The town had already reached its verdict. Without hearing a single word. Without knowing a single truth. The lawyer stepped forward, clearing his throat. Ethan Calloway. Ethan slowly looked away from the woman. According to your father's final agreement. He unfolded another weathered document. Miss Nayeli is your lawful bride. The silence that followed felt heavier than thunder. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else spat into the dust. Across the street, the blacksmith quietly removed his gloves, watching as though history itself had arrived inside that battered stagecoach. Nayeli said nothing. She simply reached behind her and lifted a weathered cedar trunk from the coach without asking anyone for help. It should have taken 2 men to move. Yet she carried it alone with calm, measured steps. She placed it gently beside the church entrance. Not with pride, not with defiance, only dignity. Then she finally spoke. Her English carried only the faintest trace of another language. If your heart refuses this marriage. She paused, meeting Ethan's uncertain eyes once more. I will leave before sunset. No tears, no pleading, no anger, only quiet respect. Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because for the first time in his life, the greatest weight on his shoulders was not the ranch. It was the truth hidden inside the woman everyone had already decided they understood. The church doors remained open, but no one stepped inside. People lingered beneath the wooden awning and along the dusty street, pretending to adjust saddles or sweep porches while their eyes never left Ethan Calloway and the Apache woman standing 20 feet apart. The wind carried the scent of sun-baked timber and distant sagebrush. Somewhere behind the stable, a horse stamped impatiently, breaking the silence for only a heartbeat before the whispers returned. Ethan had faced stampedes. He had buried his father with his own hands. He had watched drought steal half his herd. None of those moments had left him standing this still. The lawyer carefully rolled the document closed and slipped it back into his satchel. "The agreement stands," he said quietly. "Whether the ceremony continues is now your decision." His words sounded strangely small against the weight pressing on Ethan's chest. Across from him, Nayeli neither pleaded nor defended herself. She simply rested one hand on the cedar trunk beside her, waiting with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that storms always reveal the person's true nature. A sharp voice suddenly cut through the crowd. "You can't marry her." It came from Walter Briggs, owner of the largest cattle ranch east of Dry Creek. He stepped into the road, boots striking the earth with deliberate force. "This town has rules." Several men nodded. Others avoided Ethan's eyes. Walter folded his arms. "Your father would have never wanted this." Ethan slowly lifted his head. "You knew my father?" Walter hesitated. "No." "Then don't tell me what he wanted." The answer was calm, not loud, yet it silenced Walter for a moment. Only a moment. "Look around you," Walter continued. "You think folks will trade cattle with a man who brings an Apache wife into this town? You think children will come near your ranch? You'll lose everything." Every sentence landed like another stone dropped into still water. Not because Ethan believed them, because part of him feared they might become true. He looked toward Nayeli again. She still hadn't spoken. Her gaze wandered briefly across the church windows where sunlight filtered through dusty glass, painting pale lines across the wooden floor. Then she quietly bent down, picked up her cedar trunk once more, and turned away from the church. The movement caught everyone by surprise. She walked only a few steps before stopping. Without facing Ethan, she spoke softly enough that only those nearest could hear. "My people taught me that a promise forced by shame carries no honor." She looked toward the distant hills beyond the town. "I will not be the reason your father's name becomes a burden." Her fingers loosened from the trunk's handle. "If choosing freedom costs me this marriage." She smiled sadly. "Then I choose your freedom." The words drifted through the warm afternoon like smoke from an extinguished fire. No accusation, no bitterness, only grace. Ethan watched her shoulders rise with a slow breath before she reached into the trunk and removed a neatly folded blanket, preparing herself for another journey instead of another argument. That quiet dignity unsettled him more deeply than anger ever could. He had expected resistance, perhaps tears, perhaps desperate explanations. Instead, she was leaving before anyone could cast her out. An elderly minister stepped onto the porch, his weathered Bible resting beneath one arm. For several long seconds, he studied the young woman. Then Ethan. Finally, he spoke. "I've married soldiers before battles. I've married widows beside fresh graves. And I've buried enough proud men to know fear when I see it." His old eyes settled on Ethan. "The question isn't whether this woman belongs here." He paused. "The question is whether you are about to spend the rest of your life wondering what kind of man walked away today." The words lingered in the afternoon air. Ethan's hands slowly tightened into fists. His father's face appeared in his memory, weathered by wind and years, always saying the same thing whenever life became difficult. A man's character is measured by the promises he keeps when everyone tells him to break them. The memory struck harder than any punch. Ethan looked toward Nayeli once more. She had already lifted the cedar trunk again. She was walking toward the edge of town. Not once did she look back. Hidden beneath a folded wool blanket inside the trunk, something made of polished silver caught a narrow beam of sunlight. It flashed only once before disappearing again. No one noticed it. No one except Ethan. And for reasons he could not yet explain, that brief glimmer felt less like the end of a marriage, and more like the beginning of a secret his father had carried to the grave. The sun had already slipped behind the western ridge when Ethan finally left the church. The streets of Dry Creek were nearly empty now. The excitement had faded into gossip. Windows glowed with warm lamplight as families gathered around supper tables, while scattered voices drifted from the saloon farther down the road. Every conversation carried the same subject: the cowboy, the Apache woman, the marriage that never happened. Ethan walked without speaking. His boots stirred thin clouds of dust that shimmered beneath the fading orange sky. Ahead of him, Nayeli continued toward the northern trail, the cedar trunk balanced steadily in both hands despite its obvious weight. She never once asked for help. Something about that unsettled him. Most travelers complained. Most strangers looked over their shoulders, hoping someone might offer kindness. She expected neither. Easier to carry everything yourself, his father had once said. When you've learned the world rarely offers another pair of hands. The memory slowed his steps. Nayeli. His voice barely rose above the evening wind. She stopped, turned, waited. No surprise crossed her face. It was almost as though she had known he would come. Ethan caught up several moments later, breathing harder than the short walk deserved. I never told you to leave. You didn't have to. Her answer was gentle. The town already spoke. They don't speak for me. She studied him quietly. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. The prairie breeze tugged softly at the loose strands of her dark hair, while somewhere nearby a meadowlark called from a weathered fence post. Finally, Ethan reached for the cedar trunk. I'll carry this. She hesitated, then slowly released the handle. The trunk nearly slipped from Ethan's hands. It was astonishingly heavy, far heavier than its size suggested. He adjusted his grip, trying not to show his surprise. A faint smile appeared at the corner of Nayeli's mouth. Still want to carry it? He answered with a quiet nod. Together, they began walking toward Broken Creek Ranch. The journey lasted nearly 2 hours. Neither hurried. Neither searched for conversation. Instead, silence settled naturally between them. Not an uncomfortable silence. Only one waiting to discover its own language. The moon climbed higher as coyotes called across distant hills. The smell of wild sage mixed with cool evening air, replacing the dust of town with something older. Something untouched. Nayeli occasionally glanced toward the stars as though reading directions written across the sky. You know this land? Ethan finally asked. I know the sky above it. My father always got lost after sunset. She smiled faintly. The earth remembers more than maps. He considered that answer for several steps. It sounded less like conversation and more like wisdom handed down through generations. Broken Creek Ranch finally emerged from the darkness. The cabin stood alone beneath a sprawling cottonwood tree, its porch weathered by countless winters. A windmill turned slowly beside the well. Beyond it stretched empty corrals and quiet pastures disappearing into silver moonlight. Home, or what had remained of one since his father's passing. Ethan pushed open the front door. The familiar scent of old pine, leather saddles, and cold ashes greeted him. Everything inside remained exactly where his father had left it months before. Nothing had changed. Nothing except the woman standing behind him. He set the cedar trunk beside the fireplace with a dull thud. For the first time since leaving town, Nayeli slowly knelt beside it. She removed a small iron key hidden beneath the leather cord around her neck. The lock clicked open. Ethan looked away. It isn't my business. No. She lifted the heavy lid. But perhaps it should be. Inside rested no jewelry, no expensive clothing, no gold. Instead, every object had clearly survived a long journey across many years. A neatly folded American cavalry flag, a weathered revolver wrapped in buckskin, bundles of dried herbs tied with red thread, a hand-carved wooden horse polished smooth by countless fingers. Then Ethan noticed something that stole the air from his lungs. Carefully folded beneath everything else lay a faded white handkerchief. Embroidered in one corner were 2 initials. E.C. His initials? No. His father's. Elias Calloway. Ethan stared in silence. His father had owned only one embroidered handkerchief. He had buried him without it. Slowly, Nayeli lifted the cloth into the firelight. I believe, she said quietly, this belonged to the man you called father. The room fell completely still. Outside, the windmill turned once, twice, then stopped. Ethan looked from the handkerchief to the woman who somehow possessed it. And in that single impossible moment, he understood one thing with absolute certainty. His father's greatest secret had never been buried beneath a gravestone. It had been walking toward him all along. The cabin remained silent long after the handkerchief settled back into Nayeli's hands. The fire cracked softly inside the stone hearth, throwing slow-moving shadows across the pine walls. Outside, the wind brushed through the cottonwood leaves with a whisper that sounded almost like distant voices. Ethan could not take his eyes off the faded embroidery. His father's initials. The stitches were uneven. His mother had sewn them herself years before she died. He remembered watching her by the window, humming quietly as afternoon sunlight rested across her lap. That handkerchief had disappeared before Ethan turned 12. His father never explained where it had gone. I buried him without it, Ethan said at last. I know. Nayeli folded the cloth with careful hands, treating it as though it carried more than thread and fabric. It was never meant to be buried. She reached into the cedar trunk once again. This time she lifted an old leather pouch, its edges cracked by age and weather. The drawstring had been repaired more than once with thin strips of buckskin. She held it for several moments before placing it gently on the kitchen table. You should open it. Ethan hesitated. The leather felt smooth from decades of use. As he loosened the knot, the scent of cedar, dried sage, and old parchment drifted into the room. Inside rested several carefully preserved objects. A brass cavalry button, a broken silver pocket watch, 3 old rifle cartridges wrapped in cloth, and beneath them, a folded sketch drawn with charcoal. Ethan slowly unfolded the brittle paper. His breath caught. The drawing showed 2 men standing beside a younger cottonwood tree. One wore a weathered rancher's hat. The other wore the clothing of an Apache elder. Both smiled. Their hands rested on each other's shoulders. The artist had written only one sentence beneath the sketch. Brothers by promise. The word struck Ethan harder than any rifle shot. My father. He was dying. Nayeli finished the sentence quietly. My father told me the rest before he joined the ancestors. She walked toward the window, looking out across the moonlit pasture. Many winters ago your father was riding alone. A blizzard came early. He lost his horse. He would have frozen before morning. Ethan listened without interrupting. My father found him nearly unconscious beneath a fallen pine. He carried him for miles. He brought him into our winter camp. The fire popped sharply behind them. For 12 days the tribe cared for a stranger everyone else feared. He survived. Ethan lowered his eyes to the sketch. My father never spoke about any of this. No, because both men made the same promise. They believed some promises become weaker when spoken too often. Silence settled once more. Not empty. Full. Heavy. Ethan slowly turned the sketch over. Another surprise waited there. A rough map. Several landmarks surrounded a narrow blue line winding through unfamiliar hills. What is this? Nayeli approached the table. My father called it the living spring. The water never dries. It kept both our families alive during the Great Drought. Ethan frowned. There isn't a spring anywhere near this ranch. There wasn't. She looked directly into his eyes. Not after people stopped remembering where to look. He studied the map more carefully. Something about its shape felt strangely familiar. The ridges, the creek, the cottonwood. Every landmark pointed toward land surrounding Broken Creek Ranch. Land his father had never allowed anyone to sell. Never lease. Never divide. Even when money became scarce. Even when neighbors called him stubborn. A sudden knock shattered the silence. 3 heavy blows against the front door. Ethan instinctively reached for the revolver hanging beside the fireplace. Another knock followed. Harder. When he opened the door, Walter Briggs stood on the porch with 2 ranch hands behind him. Lantern light illuminated their stern faces. Walter removed his hat. Not out of respect. Out of calculation. I came to give you one last chance. His eyes drifted toward Nayeli standing inside the cabin. Send her away tonight. You can still save your reputation. Ethan said nothing. Walter smiled coldly. Keep her. He glanced slowly across the ranch, stretching into darkness. And you'll soon discover how lonely a man becomes when every neighbor decides his fences no longer deserve to stand. Without another word, Walter turned his horse toward town. The 3 riders disappeared into the night. Only the sound of hoofbeats remained. Ethan closed the door slowly. Behind him, the old map still rested on the table. The living spring. The forgotten promise. His father's hidden friendship. And now, a powerful rancher willing to threaten everything before Ethan even understood what he had inherited. For the first time, Ethan realized Walter Briggs wasn't afraid of an Apache woman. He was afraid of something she had brought with her. The next morning arrived with no answers. Only the pale gold light of dawn stretching across the empty pasture, as though the prairie itself had been holding its breath. Ethan barely slept. The old sketch, the map, and the leather pouch remained on the kitchen table exactly where they had been left. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the words written beneath the drawing. Brothers by promise. His father had never lied to him. But somehow, he had hidden an entire lifetime. Outside, cattle stirred restlessly behind the north fence. A dry wind swept across the grasslands, carrying more dust than moisture. Summer had arrived early, and the earth already showed the first thin cracks of another difficult season. Nayeli stepped onto the porch carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. She offered one to Ethan. He accepted it with a quiet nod. For several minutes, they simply watched the sunrise. "The grass shouldn't be this pale," she said softly. "It gets worse every year." "It will." Her answer carried certainty rather than fear. "The clouds pass over these hills without stopping." Ethan glanced toward her. "You can tell that?" "My grandfather taught children to read the wind before they learned to read words." She walked to the edge of the porch, kneeling beside a patch of dry soil. Her fingertips brushed the dirt. Then she looked toward the western ridge. "The spring is still alive." Ethan frowned. "You've never been here before." "I've been here many times." He turned quickly. She smiled gently at his confusion. "Not with my feet." She pointed toward the old map resting inside the cabin. "My father described every hill, every cottonwood, every bend of Broken Creek. He wanted me to remember them." Ethan followed her gaze. "So he expected you to come here?" "Yes." Silence settled between them once more. Finally, he asked the question that had haunted him since the previous night. Why didn't he come himself? The warmth disappeared from Nayeli's eyes. "He tried." Her voice became almost a whisper. "He died before he could." The answer lingered heavily in the morning air. Before Ethan could respond, frantic hoofbeats echoed across the valley. A young ranch hand rode through the front gate, his horse lathered with sweat. "Mr. Calloway." He barely waited for the horse to stop. "You'd better come." "The Henderson Ranch. Their horses are dying." Ethan grabbed his hat. "What happened?" "No one's sure. They stopped eating yesterday. This morning 3 of them collapsed." Within minutes, they were riding toward the neighboring ranch. When they arrived, the scene looked worse than expected. Powerful workhorses stood with lowered heads, breathing heavily. Others lay on the ground, unable to rise. The owner, Samuel Henderson, wiped sweat from his brow. "I've sent for the veterinarian. He won't arrive until tomorrow. I'll lose every one of them." Several ranchers stood nearby, exchanging worried guesses. "Poison. Bad grain. Snakebite." No one agreed. Nayeli quietly stepped past them. No one invited her. No one stopped her. She knelt beside the weakest mare. Instead of examining the animal's mouth first, she gently pressed both hands against its neck. She closed her eyes, listened. Then she stood. "It's not disease." Several men exchanged skeptical looks. Samuel frowned. "Then what is it?" She walked toward the water trough. She dipped 2 fingers into the water, smelled it, tasted only a single drop. Then she poured the remaining water onto the ground. The muddy puddle immediately released a sharp, bitter odor beneath the morning sun. "This water has turned. The algae beneath the surface poisoned it." One rancher laughed. "Water doesn't poison horses." Nayeli ignored him. Instead, she walked into the nearby meadow. Within minutes, she returned carrying several bunches of wild herbs. She crushed the leaves between 2 smooth stones, mixed them with clean water from a barrel, then patiently fed the mixture to the weakest mare. Everyone watched. No one spoke. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Then, the mare slowly lifted her head. Its breathing steadied. A few moments later, it struggled onto trembling legs. Samuel stared in disbelief. The other horses began drinking the fresh water Nayeli had ordered drawn from a nearby well. By afternoon, every animal remained alive. Not fully recovered, but alive. Samuel removed his hat. His weathered eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved them." Nayeli simply wiped her hands on a cloth. "The horses wanted to live. I only helped them remember how." Even the men who had doubted her found no words to answer. As Ethan watched the ranchers gather around the recovered mare, something shifted quietly inside him. Yesterday, he had seen an Apache woman the town refused to accept. Today, he saw someone whose wisdom could save an entire valley. Yet across the road, Walter Briggs sat silently on horseback, watching every grateful face turn toward Nayeli. And behind the calm expression beneath his broad-brimmed hat, his jaw tightened, not because the horses had survived, but because, for the first time since she arrived in Dry Creek, the town had witnessed something far more dangerous than an old promise. They had witnessed the beginning of respect. The most dangerous enemy is rarely the man who shouts the loudest. It is the one who smiles while quietly convincing everyone else to fear the truth. By the following afternoon, the story had traveled far beyond the Henderson Ranch. People no longer spoke only about an Apache woman. They spoke about the Apache woman who had saved 12 horses after every white rancher had failed. Some called it luck. Others called it witchcraft. Very few admitted it might simply be knowledge. Dry Creek had always been a town that trusted familiar faces more than unfamiliar wisdom. Walter Briggs understood that better than anyone. He sat alone on the porch of the saloon, slowly stirring the melting ice inside a glass of whiskey while men gathered around him. They say she cured Henderson's horses. Walter smiled without looking up. They also say gamblers can make gold appear from empty sleeves. A few men chuckled. The question isn't whether she healed a horse. He finally lifted his eyes. The question is what comes next. Silence settled around the table. Walter leaned forward. Today it's horses. Tomorrow she tells your wives how to raise children. The day after that, he paused deliberately. She'll tell you who owns this valley. No one answered. Not because they believed him completely, because fear always grows faster than facts. Meanwhile, Ethan and Nayeli rode quietly across Broken Creek Ranch, following the landmarks drawn on the old map. The afternoon sun baked the prairie until waves of heat shimmered above the grass. Every now and then Nayeli would stop her horse. She would study the hills, the shape of scattered rocks, the flight of hawks circling overhead. The creek changed. She spoke almost to herself. What do you mean? The water once turned east. She pointed toward a shallow depression nearly hidden beneath waist-high grass. Now it bends south. Ethan climbed down from his horse. He knelt beside the dry channel. His fingers brushed loose gravel polished smooth by water that had vanished many years earlier. My father never mentioned this. He protected it. Nayeli answered quietly. He knew someone would eventually ask why. They continued deeper into the valley. Hours passed beneath the relentless sun. Then Nayeli suddenly stopped walking. She stood perfectly still beside a circle of weathered stones, almost buried beneath weeds. Without speaking, she knelt. Her hands brushed away decades of dust. Beneath the dirt appeared an old carving. Two symbols. One was a simple cattle brand. The other, an Apache sun mark. Side by side. Equal. Ethan stared silently. My father's brand. Nayeli nodded. Our elders carved them together. She smiled faintly. They believed friendship deserved something stronger than paper. For several moments neither spoke. The wind carried only the rustle of dry grass. Then Nayeli looked toward a towering cottonwood standing alone on the ridge. We're close. They climbed slowly. The old tree spread its enormous branches across the hillside, its roots twisting through layers of ancient stone. Nayeli walked directly to the western side of the trunk. She tapped the ground lightly with the heel of her boot. Once. Twice. The third strike produced a hollow sound. Ethan frowned. He grabbed a shovel from his saddle. Within minutes they uncovered a flat limestone slab. Together they pushed it aside. A narrow opening appeared beneath. Cool air drifted upward carrying the unmistakable scent of fresh water. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. He lowered himself carefully into the shallow chamber. There it was. Crystal clear water flowed silently through solid rock before disappearing beneath the hillside. Not a puddle. Not a seasonal stream. A living spring. Even after decades, it still breathed beneath the earth. He looked upward toward Nayeli. You were right. She simply smiled. No. My father was. Ethan cupped water into his hands. It tasted colder than mountain snow. Cleaner than any well he had ever known. Enough water to keep every pasture alive. Enough to change the future of Broken Creek Ranch forever. Enough to explain why his father had refused every offer to sell this land. Above them, neither noticed a distant figure watching through a brass spyglass from the opposite ridge. Walter Briggs slowly lowered the glass. His face revealed no surprise, only confirmation. So, he whispered to himself. The spring still exists. Behind him waited 3 mounted riders. One stepped forward. What now? Walter never looked away from the cottonwood tree. Now they know. His voice became almost cold enough to match the steel hanging at his side. Which means we no longer have time to persuade them. He turned his horse toward town. We'll make sure they never get the chance to use it. Far below, Ethan climbed back into the sunlight, carrying nothing more than wet hands and quiet hope. He still believed the greatest treasure hidden beneath his ranch was the spring itself. He had not yet realized that water was never Walter Briggs' true prize. The land surrounding it was. The hardest choices are never made at the end of a gun. They are made in the silence before dawn, when no one is watching except your own conscience. That night, the wind changed. It swept across Broken Creek Ranch with an unfamiliar chill, rattling the loose shutters and bending the tall prairie grass until it moved like dark waves beneath the moon. Ethan stood on the porch long after the lantern inside had burned low. He could still hear Walter Briggs' voice echoing in his mind. "We'll make sure they never get the chance to use it." The threat had not sounded like anger. It had sounded like certainty. Inside the cabin, Nayeli quietly wrapped the old map in soft buckskin before placing it back inside the cedar trunk. Every movement was slow, careful, almost ceremonial. Ethan watched from the doorway. You knew this would happen. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she rested her hand upon the turquoise pendant hanging around her neck. My father believed promises attract enemies, and secrets attract even more. He stepped inside. Then why bring the map here? Because some promises are worth the danger. Those words lingered between them. Outside, a coyote cried somewhere beyond the northern ridge. Then another answered. The sound carried across the valley like an old warning. Before sunrise, Ethan awoke to the frantic barking of his sheepdogs. He reached for his rifle and rushed outside. Smoke drifted above the eastern pasture. His heart tightened. He sprinted toward the corrals. The sight stopped him cold. Someone had cut nearly every fence surrounding the lower grazing field. Dozens of cattle had scattered into the open prairie during the night. Fresh hoofprints crossed the broken rails. Boot prints. 3 different men. Nothing had been stolen, only released. A message. Samuel Henderson arrived an hour later with several ranch hands. Together, they spent the morning gathering frightened cattle beneath the growing heat. No one complained. No one mentioned Walter's name. But every man understood. This had not been an accident. As the final steer returned through the repaired gate, Samuel removed his gloves. You should send her away. Ethan looked at him in surprise. You too. Samuel sighed heavily. I don't believe she's the problem. He glanced across the pasture where Nayeli quietly repaired one of the damaged fence posts with strips of rawhide. But people need someone to blame. And Walter is giving them exactly that. Ethan watched Nayeli working alone beneath the relentless sun. Not once had she asked who destroyed the fence. Not once had she complained. She simply repaired what others had broken. Later that afternoon, while replacing the final rail, Ethan noticed something lying beneath the shattered timber. A silver badge, half buried in the dust. He picked it up. It belonged to Deputy Frank Miller, one of Walter Briggs' closest friends. The badge must have torn free during the night. Evidence. Small, almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore. He slipped it quietly into his pocket. Not even Nayeli saw him do it. As evening settled over the ranch, she prepared supper in silence. The aroma of venison stew mixed with wild herbs filled the cabin. For the first time since she had arrived, the place no longer felt abandoned. The empty chair where Elias Calloway once sat somehow seemed less lonely. Ethan looked across the table. I never thanked you. She raised her eyes. For what? For saving Henderson's horses. A gentle smile touched her face. My grandmother used to say, gratitude belongs to the Creator. We only borrow it long enough to pass it to someone else. Again, there was that quiet wisdom. Never preached. Never forced. Simply offered. Ethan lowered his gaze. I've spent my whole life believing strength meant protecting my land. He paused. Maybe strength means protecting the people who belong on it. Neither spoke after that. The fire crackled softly between them. Outside, darkness slowly covered the valley. Far beyond the ranch, hidden among the cottonwood trees overlooking the spring, 3 mounted riders waited without lighting a fire. Walter Briggs sat beside them, studying a rough map spread across his saddle. He pointed toward the hillside where the hidden spring flowed beneath the earth. We move tomorrow night. One rider frowned. What about Calloway? Walter folded the map. If he stands aside, he keeps his ranch. And if he doesn't? Walter's expression never changed. Then by the time this valley wakes, everyone will believe the Apache woman disappeared with the map. He looked once more toward the distant lights glowing from Ethan's cabin. Fear always believes the easiest story. Miles away, inside that warm little cabin, Nayeli quietly removed the turquoise pendant from around her neck. She held it in her palm for several long moments. Then, without a single word, she placed it beside Ethan's plate, as though she had already begun preparing herself. to lose the only home she had ever hoped to find. A lie can outrun the truth for a single night. But dawn has a way of making every shadow answer for itself. Ethan woke before sunrise. The place beside the fireplace where Nayeli usually sat was empty. The cedar trunk was gone. So was the turquoise pendant she had left beside his plate. Only one folded piece of paper remained on the kitchen table. His hands tightened as he unfolded it. The writing was careful, simple. If you read this, you are already carrying more than your father ever wanted for you. Do not carry me as well. Protect the spring. Keep your promise. Forget my name. Nayeli. For a long moment Ethan simply stared at the page. Outside, the morning birds had begun to sing. Inside, the cabin had never felt so silent. He stepped onto the porch. Fresh wagon tracks led north. Not toward the Apache lands. Toward Dry Creek. His heart sank. She hadn't run away. She had gone to face the danger before it reached him. Without another thought, he saddled his horse. Dust exploded beneath the hooves as he rode toward town. The streets of Dry Creek looked strangely crowded for so early an hour. Nearly everyone had gathered in front of the courthouse. Whispers moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. There she is. They caught her. I heard she stole something. Walter Briggs stood near the courthouse steps wearing the satisfied expression of a man watching his own plan unfold exactly as intended. Beside him stood Deputy Frank Miller. The silver badge Ethan had found beneath the broken fence was once again pinned neatly to the deputy's chest. A second badge. The first one had been lost. The second replaced it. Walter had already erased the evidence. Nayeli stood quietly between two deputies. Her hands were not tied. She offered no resistance. At her feet rested the cedar trunk. Walter raised his voice so everyone could hear. The Apache woman was discovered carrying stolen property belonging to this valley. Someone in the crowd shouted, "The map." Another added, "She's trying to claim our land." Fear spread exactly as Walter had predicted. Not because anyone had seen proof. Because fear rarely waits for proof. Walter slowly opened the cedar trunk. He lifted out the old map, then the cavalry button, the pocket watch, the embroidered handkerchief. Each object was held up like evidence before a jury that had already decided its verdict. "You see," Walter declared, "everything was hidden. What honest person hides these things?" The townspeople murmured. Some nodded. Others looked uncertain. Samuel Henderson stood near the back of the crowd. He said nothing. Neither did the minister. Nayeli remained completely still. Walter smiled. "You have one chance. Tell everyone where the spring is, and perhaps this town will allow you to leave in peace." She looked directly at him. "My father protected that water. So did Ethan's. I will not betray either." Walter's smile disappeared. "So be it." He turned toward the deputy. "Confiscate everything." The deputy reached for the cedar trunk. At that exact moment, another voice echoed across the square. "Don't touch it." Every head turned. Ethan rode into town without slowing his horse until it stopped directly between Nayeli and the deputies. Dust swirled around them. He climbed down, calmly, without reaching for his revolver. Walter laughed. "You're making a mistake." "No," Ethan answered quietly. "I've been making mistakes since the stagecoach arrived." He reached inside his coat. The crowd held its breath. Instead of a weapon, he removed the silver badge he had found beneath the broken fence. He walked toward Deputy Miller. "This belongs to you." The deputy's face lost its color. "I don't know what you're talking about. You dropped it while cutting my fences." The square fell silent. Walter interrupted immediately. "That's ridiculous." Ethan ignored him. He turned instead toward the gathered ranchers. "Ask yourselves one question. If Nayeli came to steal this land," he looked toward the recovered horses grazing peacefully outside town, "why did she save yours first?" No one answered. Samuel Henderson slowly stepped forward. "He has a point." Another rancher removed his hat. "So do I." One by one, men who had watched Nayeli heal their animals, repair broken fences, and ask nothing in return, began stepping out from the crowd. Not shouting, not threatening, simply standing. Beside her, Walter looked around in disbelief. His plan depended on fear. Instead, he found himself surrounded by quiet people who had finally begun trusting what they had witnessed with their own eyes. And for the first time since the stagecoach rolled into Dry Creek, Walter Briggs realized he was no longer fighting an Apache woman. He was fighting the truth. Justice rarely arrives with the sound of gunfire. More often, It arrives when the last lie has nowhere left to hide. No one moved. The square stood frozen beneath the afternoon sun. Walter Briggs looked from one familiar face to another, searching for the certainty that had always surrounded him. He found only silence. Samuel Henderson stepped forward first, then the blacksmith, then the elderly minister. One by one, ranchers who had spent years tipping their hats to Walter quietly crossed the dusty street until they stood beside Ethan and Nayeli. No speeches, no shouting, just footsteps. Sometimes that is how history changes. Deputy Frank Miller's hands began to tremble. He looked toward Walter. Walter offered no help, only a cold stare that said one thing. Say nothing. The minister broke the silence. Deputy. His voice remained calm. Did you cut Mr. Calloway's fences? Miller swallowed. His eyes drifted toward the silver badge in Ethan's hand, then toward the dozens of townspeople watching him. Finally, he lowered his head. Yes. The single word spread across the square like the first clap of thunder before a storm. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Walter took one quick step backward. Miller continued. It wasn't her. He pointed toward Nayeli. It was us. Mr. Briggs ordered it. He said people would blame the Apache woman. And once Calloway lost enough cattle, he'd have no choice but to sell the ranch. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Walter's face hardened. Liar. But the strength had disappeared from his voice. Miller reached inside his coat. He removed a folded contract. I signed this. He handed it to the minister. It promised me 200 acres after the ranch was sold. The minister unfolded the paper. His weathered eyes moved slowly across every line. Then he quietly handed it to Samuel Henderson. Soon another rancher read it. Then another. No one argued. No one needed to. Walter Briggs had condemned himself with his own signature. He looked around once more. The fear that had once protected him was gone. Only disappointment remained. Without another word, Walter turned toward his horse. He climbed into the saddle. For one brief moment, it seemed he might reach for the revolver resting at his side. Instead, his shoulders lowered. He removed the gun, placed it across the saddle horn, and rode away without looking back. No one chased him. Some defeats require no pursuit. The sheriff from the neighboring county arrived before sunset. Deputy Miller surrendered peacefully. Walter Briggs was arrested 3 days later while attempting to cross the state line. The hidden spring never became the property of one man. Instead, Ethan invited every neighboring ranch to draw water during the dry months, honoring the agreement his father and Nayeli's father had made decades before. No contracts, no payment, only trust. The first wagon to arrive belonged to Samuel Henderson. The second belonged to the blacksmith. Within weeks, fences once built to divide neighbors became places where people stopped to share water, tools, and stories. Late one evening, after the valley had settled into another quiet sunset, Ethan and Nayeli walked together beneath the great cottonwood overlooking the spring. The same tree where two fathers had once carved their friendship into stone. The old carving remained. A cattle brand, an Apache son, still side by side. Ethan reached into his pocket. He unfolded the embroidered handkerchief one last time, then carefully placed it beneath the tree's roots, not as something lost, but as something finally returned. He looked toward Nayeli. I spent half my life believing my father left me a ranch. She smiled softly. What did he leave you? Ethan watched the clear water flow beneath the evening light. A promise. Nayeli slipped her hand gently into his. Neither spoke again. They did not need to. The wind carried the scent of fresh water across the valley. Children's laughter echoed from distant ranch houses. Cattle drank peacefully beside neighbors who no longer cared whose land ended where. Long after Walter Briggs' name faded into forgotten conversations, people still remembered the spring. But even more than that, they remembered the day an Apache woman arrived in a dusty stagecoach carrying nothing that looked valuable. Only a cedar trunk, a hidden promise, and the quiet courage to answer hatred with dignity. Some called it the day Dry Creek changed. Others simply said that was the day two old fathers finally kept the promise they had made beneath a young cottonwood tree. Out on the frontier, justice never belonged to the fastest gun. It belonged to the people who chose compassion when fear seemed easier. And that is why, whenever the wind passes through the branches above the living spring, old ranchers still smile before saying the same quiet words to their grandchildren. The water was always here. We just needed the right hearts to find it.